Welcome back to the Royal Road Report, where I share with you some of the wonderful stories available on Royal Road, so that you can find your next series to get into. 3 episodes in and I'm starting to figure out what I want to do with this series. No long intro today, I'm just going to get into today's highlighted stories and then talk a bit afterwards. Starting us off, we have Weeaboo's Unfortunate Isekai, The Necromancer's Gacha by Weeaboo. This is an interesting story and one that I almost didn't get into before it managed to really surprise me. The story starts with our main character, possibly called Liam, and no, I won't explain what I mean by that, getting summoned from his comfortable life to take part in a game run by a mysterious hooded figure. Why exactly the game is being created isn't clear, and the hooded figure doesn't offer much in the way of explanation, mostly because it turns out he accidentally summoned the wrong guy. So Liam gets told that he's being turned into a sacrificial lamb. His doomed attempt at the game will be used to make things better for the next guy. His goal is to defend the tower he's in, which will be regularly attacked by monsters, and he can't fight them himself, he has to use the summons offered by the game. The game, as stated in the title, is a gacha game, and the author must play them himself because he really manages to nail the scummy cash grab vibe of a bad gacha. There's a lot of jokes in the first few chapters about gacha, weebs, and anything related. So many in fact that it almost put me off the first time. Usually when a story like this goes so far out of its way to make fun, it's because the story is trying to indulge heavily in those things, and the author wants to distance themselves by poking fun before anyone else can criticize. Not the case here. We get a few more cheap shots, but then it starts to get into the actual story. And chapter by chapter, those jokes fall away and get replaced by a plot actually worth getting invested in. I have to be honest, when I started this one, I didn't expect too much. I pushed past the beginning because I was curious how the game system would be done, and I did find the start a little funny. The story does have a comedy tag, and it is funny later on without a doubt, but way more than being funny, it's interesting. There's really only so much I can say without giving some major spoilers, but this is a way more dark and serious story than the opening would suggest. There is a surprising amount of emotional investment being squeezed out of an extremely limited cast that's stuck in one location. If you enjoy battles that feature detailed strategy, a well-written story with some very good character development, and cursing RNG for your gacha pulls, then I highly recommend Weeaboo's Unfortunate Isekai. Next up, we have Pluto by Magus Josh. This is an older fiction from a few years ago, and also a completed novel. It focuses on Talia Red Owl, a daughter of Athena, which might sound a little familiar to some of you. Alongside big hits like Percy Jackson, Lore Olympus, or the game Hades, there have been a slew of Greek mythology-inspired works over the last 10 years. It became a whole thing for a while, and Pluto I think is definitely one of the better ones. Talia starts the story as a student in a class of divine children on graduation day, deciding whether they're going to go live in the mortal world or work for the Pantheon. Instead of her expected path, Talia is told that she will be appointed to the role of Pluto, the representative and avatar of Hades. Given rather little opportunity to say no, she takes up the position and starts working in the underworld. For those who are familiar with novels featuring young adult protagonists in Greek mythology, you might have assumed that it follows the predictable path of having Talia first after Hades, but that is avoided and the story takes a bit more interesting of a direction. After the first few chapters see her get set up, we then have a small time skip before getting into the meat of the story, a nice bit of divine plotting and intrigue. When pulling from other material like this, there's always a balance to be struck between hitting the established tropes and adding your own stuff. That goes for using established public domain characters like Sherlock Holmes as much as it does for using mythology, even if the latter is a little more loosely defined. Pluto sets up a pretty good urban fantasy that manages to include a lot of characters in a very natural way. All in all, this is a solid novel. It's not Royal Road's more popular style, but if you're looking for a more traditional novel and a character instead of power or system-based narrative, it's a good read. For something a bit closer to Royal Road's usual tastes, we have Koyuki the Necromancing Foxkin by Atom. Koyuki is a slave who discovers her talent for magic during an attack. She is swiftly recruited and offered her freedom and an education at a military academy in return for service in the army. I suppose if it worked for the Romans, it works for a fantasy nation. Despite the grim setup, it's a very light-hearted story. That doesn't mean it's not violent. Koyuki and the friends she soon makes are pretty quick to reach for a sword to solve their problems, but the tone of the story is not very serious at all. There's plenty of joking around in between lessons and dealing with the occasional sinister plot. I wouldn't go so far as to call this a magic school story. It certainly takes place in a school, and there are lessons and teaching, but the inclusion of military elements, Koyuki's independent study of her necromancy, and the story's focus on plot elements outside the academy really draw away from that. I think the story could have been told with Koyuki joining the military directly and learning on the job or in a training camp, instead of at an academy, and it wouldn't have changed too much. That's not to say it's bad, just understand what to expect. The magic system is broadly elemental, with each mage having affinity for one or more specific elements. We spend a good amount of time figuring out necromancy, and I do think the story does a good job of how that part of the teaching is set up. It feels like a magic system that is light on the details but has enough rules that figuring things out feels largely earned for the characters, even with the occasional mysterious power boost. The characters themselves are suitably fun for a story-tagged slice of life. They have pretty strong personalities that mesh well, and there are moments of just hanging out and living in the world feel like story and not filler. It's a chill story that I would put in the cute girls doing cute things category of anime, except sometimes cute things include wiping out the enemy and reanimating their corpses. And last but certainly not least, we have No Need for a Core by Zagorov. This is a dungeon core novel with the interesting twist of having more than one person in charge of a dungeon. While extra main characters weighing in on a dungeon's design is pretty normal, I can't remember any instance where a dungeon was truly controlled by more than one core. The story has a fairly large cast as time goes on, but focuses on 3 main characters. Mordecai, an ancient dungeon core that was sealed away and has now been freed. Kazue, a kitsune who died and has been given a second chance as a fresh dungeon core. And Moriko, a monk who was just passing by before fate pulls her into the middle of things. We start off with a series of random events quickly pushing our main characters together and go from there. Describing this story in only one way is difficult because it definitely leans into a few genres, and I think it does all of them well. First and foremost, this is a dungeon core story. There are, at points, multiple chapters in a row spent on designing new areas of the dungeon. Even as the story grows, a main plot and several subplots unfold and several side characters get their time in the spotlight, it all ties back to dungeon cores and dungeon building. I think that consistency is key to keeping everything together, because this story is also very much a romance. Not in the usual people getting together way, the relationship starts in the first few chapters, but in the sense that most of the main characters' motivations comes from the 3 of them trying to live a happy life together. Trying and succeeding in most cases. If it weren't for the more serious plotlines, I would almost class this as a cozy genre story. But the plot does feature a bunch of more serious topics and dips into the sort of plot points that might feature in a high fantasy adventure. Something that fits its world building, since the whole thing captures the feeling of a homebrew D&D setting. Parts of the magic shown also fit that vibe, but the dungeon cores themselves have a video game aesthetic applied to them. So that's in the terminology they use and how they think. The story is not a lit RPG and there is no system as such. Just some system-like rules to what dungeon magic specifically can do. All in all, I find No Need for a Core to be a hard one to summarize. It's a dungeon core fantasy adventure poly-romance novel that manages to give proper attention to all those areas without one compromising the others, and while developing a pretty large cast of side characters at the same time. If even one of those aspects sounds interesting to you, I recommend giving it a read. And that is all for today. I think I've got a better idea of how I'm presenting the stories now. What I tried before was probably a little too clinical, I suppose. I fell into the trap of trying to be objective, which never works when you're dealing with art. Even if I want to shout out stories that I myself don't read, I have to at least like them enough to read a few chapters so I can talk about them. We're still early in the process and there's always room to improve. One of my biggest inspirations for this series, fellow YouTuber Daniel Green, has been running his channel for a lot longer, and he still asks the audience for feedback to improve his content. On the topic of feedback, thank you to the people on the Royal Road forums who offered suggestions on the last 2 episodes. Both the feedback and recommendations are much appreciated. I did take a look at the series others were suggesting, and I recognized a few of them. I might make some separate video sometime about a few of those more popular and recognizable series. Thinking about how I recognize some of those but have never actually read them did get me thinking about how popularity on Royal Road works. Because there are definitely some series which, regardless of how many views or followers they actually have, are more well known than others. They get talked about more on the forums, and I see them recommended more often on Reddit, even if that doesn't seemingly translate into numbers on Royal Road. And trying to correlate ranking and rating to popularity and reach is near impossible. Stories that make it to the top of Rising Stars will show up on page 30 of Best Ongoing, where they'll sit just above another Rising Star story with double the followers and views, and just below a story that a fraction of the people have seen. Of course, I understand why that happens. Extra popularity can push a story down the rankings as it gets a few lower reviews, just as being relatively unknown can raise a story since people that found it and care enough to rate it generally have a higher opinion. But as someone specifically trying to find less known but still high quality stories, it does make life more difficult. I would love to hear what people consider to be a popular story. There is definitely a threshold at which stories show up more often. As I said, I got a few recommendations, thank you again for that, and there were some in there that I recognize because people bring them up more often or they feature higher in a few Royal Road lists. But being high on the list doesn't translate to having more views. So what metric would you use? I would have thought average views and followers are probably the best. To be well known, a lot of people have to have seen a story after all, but I'm not sure that's really the case. Perhaps it's a mystery we'll solve over time. For now, thanks for listening. Check out my web serial, Task for Sparkle, Magical Girl Anomaly Hunting, and I'll see you in the next episode.